In today's video blog, I am going to address a topic that, as always, comes up a lot amongst people that have been in cults or in very unhealthy groups, or in a group where unhealthy teachings flourish. And I will focus on the Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac story. The title could be, Does God require you to sacrifice your dreams in order for them to come true? I am sharing more of this story already in the testimonial interview that I did with my friend Ashley. It's also on YouTube. So I'm just not gonna give you all the details, but the point was that when I came back from my internship in Minnesota, I was in love. I wanted to marry my then fiance or boyfriend or whatever, but the leaders wouldn't have it. And the leader didn't tell me that I couldn't go back to America for any other reason but that he had this dream that made it very clear that God was saying America is no for me, no. And so I could never go back, and obviously that was severely anxiety-inducing. It was confusing. It didn't make any sense. It didn't line up with what I was sensing. To be honest with you, I felt drawn to the United States ever since I was a kid. So when I went to a internship in America and I met someone I wanted to marry, that was, I felt like this is it, you know, and you should meet my husband. You probably would like to spend more time with him too. So it just didn't make any sense. And here I knew, just like Abraham had to sacrifice, or had to be willing to sacrifice his son, I had to do the same, because God is cruel, or at least my leader is saying he's portraying him to be cruel. And I have believed him all this way, and now I'm suddenly saying, well, now that it's getting difficult for me, I'm going to reject it. I felt between a rock and a hard place, to say it mildly, and obviously it was severely traumatic, that whole experience. Years later, I continued to ask that question. Is God asking something like that of people? And it seems like where you turn in Christianity, yeah, people believe that. You just have to go in kindergarten or Sunday school and hear how they're talking about God there. Or to adults too. Adults get preached the same message. And by the way, this was just one little example of how my cult made us lay our dreams and hopes and wishes and desires for our lives, for our future, on the altar, so that God could take everything, and whatever he would give us back, that would be truly from him. You know, the thing is, there's a little bit to it, but overall, I totally disagree with that idea of God. And I want to tell you that when within my home church, it was my mother-in-law and me and my husband. He actually was the one that started the whole thing. When we got a different perspective on that story, which I will share with you, of Abraham and Isaac, it was like a linchpin. It was like that set the dominoes falling, of reading the Bible and being so confused about, well, you look at Jesus and he seems to be this really cool dude that is really concerned with how the people that are trying to get to God. And he's really upset with the ones that pretend like they have it all together and they're just playing it. They're the hypocrites. And the way he's talking about his dad, Abba, it just doesn't match with so many ways the Old Testament portrays him. And so here it goes. Here is how I would like to propose one could easily, just as legitimately, view the story of Abraham and Isaac. So Genesis 22. Hey, I actually, and this is now over 10 years ago, did exegesis on this in my theology studies, and of course I looked at it from my fundamental Baptist views, and I didn't even consider that there could be a different perspective on the whole thing. So that's just to show you that before or while I entered my cult, I was already a pretty we have all the answers. Why do we need to ask all these questions about different interpretations in my head? So once I lived that kind of life where God is kind of vicious and mean to a T, and I realized that leads to an awful life and it leads to the loss of mental health and peace, I realized I gotta keep asking questions. So here we go, Genesis 22. It starts out with saying that God tested Abraham. And the general idea is that the test is Abraham going to sacrifice his promised son? And not just the promise of a son, but the promise of a future, a legacy, like a whole people group. That's what God said to him. I'm going to make you bigger than just one kid or maybe one grandkid. I'm going to make you into a people. That's what Abraham was able to perceive from God. I mean, think about it. Abraham was this guy that lived in Ur, and he was a nobody in a nobody's land. We don't hear from Ur a whole lot more. And he didn't have a Bible, that Abraham. He didn't have any writings, or as far as we know, he only knew what he knew from God because he could hear him sometimes. And he would hear very clear directions from God. So when God told him to go out and leave Ur and let God show him the promised land, that was very daring. So there's something about Abraham that made him very bold and adventurous, but also very obedient, if you will, to that voice. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot more backstory for him, but that is something we can say about him just by reading those stories. So when God tells him to sacrifice his child, this is how we read the Bible. He responded with, your servant is listening. All right, you told me to sacrifice my child. I'm going to do that because I'm obedient and I trust you. That's kind of the best way that I came up with interpreting that story, that Abraham was actually thinking, I'm going to go through with it. And I know that God has a sacrifice already chosen for him, which is not my son, but I'm going to make it look like, I believe I'm actually going to sacrifice my son, but I will not have to because God will not ask that of me. That's kind of the best way of interpreting that story. But honestly, after what we see happening with Moses and God, where God, for instance, says to Moses, I'm going to destroy your entire people. And Moses says, no, if you destroy them, destroy me too. And God changes his perspective. God changes his mind, the way the story is told, which is its own story for itself. But we can see that Abraham didn't have that kind of relationship with God where he felt like he could be honest. Because he could have also very easily have said to God, I am gonna not sacrifice my son. It is the son you promised to me, and it is the destiny you promised to me. What the heck are you saying? Abraham could have done that. And have you ever considered that the test that God had in store for Abraham was just that, to see how Abraham would respond? Not so much for God to know, but for Abraham to know. Because here's a fun fact. That was in pagan times. In those pagan times where the Jewish religion wasn't established yet, which with the whole bloody atonement stuff and so forth, that was still, kind of barbaric, but at least they wouldn't kill people. But here in the pagan culture, wherever you turned, be it Baal or Molech, people would sacrifice their firstborn to get the gods, whatever deity or deities they worshipped, to be pleased with them, would try to persuade them, convince them of their commitment so that this said deity would be pleased and then with benevolence bless the person that sacrificed the most precious thing they had, their firstborn. So Abraham was born and raised in that culture. That's what he thought God would ask of him because of what he had seen in the religious context that he knew. Like, for instance, what would they be asking for? They'd be asking for a good harvest or better health, or maybe that the bad weather would not tear their tents apart or whatever. They would kill their firstborn in the hopes that that would sway the gods to bless them. So here is Abraham, who is hoping for God to bless him with this destination, this wonderful people group that he had, he could only envision, but the ideas of the stars of the heavens or the sand on the beach. So like infinite numbers of people, and he was excited for that. And so we know that Abraham was willing to kind of do it a little bit in human ways. Story with Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham comes to mind, where they make Ishmael because they are becoming impatient, and Abram's just kind of going along, where that again, in that story, Abram could have said, Sarah, God told us that this is going to happen, so don't lose hope, don't lose patience. But, so you see, Abram is kind of going with the flow, but in a way that doesn't seem very, like he really has, like a face-to-face view of God, like a eye-to-eye, It's more of a, I'm just gonna, whoever tells me to do something, I'm gonna kind of go along with it. That's a little bit critical of Abraham, but you can see that there seems to be a tendency of that. So while we would like to say, oh, Abraham, what a faithful guy, there are other stories to portray Abraham in just a little bit of more of a balanced human way. So, in other words, I believe that God said to Abraham, hey, what about your son? Are you going to sacrifice him for me? And because of Abraham's situation, he took that and ran with it, and God had to save Isaac. Isaac was traumatized for the rest of his life, did not turn out to be a good dad. So honestly, was that the best God had in store for Abraham and Isaac? Nope. I think Abraham missed it. He failed the test. The test was so that Abram could say, God, you made me this promise, and I believe that you're good. I believe that you do not ask me to sacrifice my child in order for me to get what I want. You have always come through. You've always come to me. You've always taken care of me and my wife and my life. And I trust that this promise that you have for me, I do not have to sacrifice myself, essentially, my child, my firstborn. Honestly, if it was the secondborn, I don't think it matters. A child is your heart walking around outside of your body. That he would have at that point could have known about God. That is not the God that is in contact with me. That is not the providence, the love, the life, the hope, the future God that I was in touch with so far. Do you see what I'm saying here? I'm saying that the view of God and what Abraham knew of the pagan religious context, where it was perfectly fine to sacrifice your children in order to sway the gods, to give you what you want, that Abraham portrayed that on God. And thankfully God saved him from that insanity, but apparently he needed to get that out of his system. And that is why it bothers me that some Christians take this story and make it some kind of a foreshadow of God sacrificing his son. Because the way I understand the gospel, and I would like to call it the beautiful gospel, I'm not the only one that calls it that, God didn't need the death of Jesus, but people did. And it says very clearly out of Jesus' own mouth, people are going to kill him. not his dad. People are, and God is delivering himself into the hands of evil people and says, do your worst. I will die. I'd rather die than kill you, but I will conquer death in the meantime, and that will be your salvation. So that is my view of God. But to go back to this theology that we have encountered in our cults, in our unhealthy groups, where the idea is that we must lay, like Isaac, the promise that we believe God gave us on the altar and let it die and see if God will keep it from dying. I said that there is maybe something to it, but I don't believe a lot about it. Here's the thing. Abraham apparently had some kind of an authority thing going on. Like he could have said to God, just because I hear this voice, I'm not gonna obey it. I'm gonna argue with this voice, and the recipient of my arguments is going to love me or be just fine with me either way. Sometimes we need to find freedom from things that oppress us. So for instance, in my cult experience, why did I not argue with the cult leader? I mean, by that time I knew arguing with them is futile, but essentially I believed that if I argue with them and I don't budge, they will kick me out. I will be on my own. I will have nobody. And that was the worst thing that I could imagine for myself. Actually, I needed my husband to point that out to me, that I had severe fears of abandonment. And so it really worked perfectly. It kept me in line. It oppressed me, but it was just like, it was like the anti-promise of God. It was this evil lie over my life that when I am by myself, something horrible is going to happen. I'm just going to be lonely and nobody. I'm telling you guys, that was my reality. So I would do anything just to not have to be alone. And so that was something that I realized as a kid, watching shows like Baywatch or Star Trek or even Seventh Heaven, they were always these tight-knit teams. They were all individual heroes, but at the end of the day, they were part of this grander, wonderful family-like group, or even they were a family and they just had each other's backs. They loved each other. They were all committed to a greater purpose. I wanted that. I wanted to be part of something super and special and important, changing the world for the better. And so I didn't want to be kicked out of that. That was my identity. And did that have to die? Yes, because otherwise I'd still be sitting there. If I hadn't been willing to give that idea that I would be alone and something horrible would happen if I was alone on the altar, I would still stew in the toxic faith and insanity of that group. And I don't know, I can't even imagine it. So you see, there are some things where we get to trust God and say, yeah, I'm going to give you that, and you show me what's on the other side, because I can't imagine what would be on the other side. When we got kicked out, and obviously my husband and I, we thought about it, should we apologize again? Because that had happened a couple times, and we said no, we are going to see this through. We followed kind of the thread that started to become more clear to us, and risked being completely alone. You could say, well, we had each other, but each other were so afraid, so terrified, that wasn't good enough. I can only say God led us out of that thing. So you see, there are things, lies that we believe about ourselves, about our future, about God, that surely, certainly need to be put on the altar. And sometimes we don't know that they are lies. So in a way, if someone says to you, well, just put it on the altar and see if God gives it back to you, or if you get to slaughter it, take it with a grain of salt. Feel it out. So if it's like a promise that you feel God gave to you, I don't know that you have to let that die. I think the reality is sometimes we have to put promises on a shelf because they just don't come true for a while. And then it takes really a toll on us to have to wait for that to happen. But honestly, I know it's difficult, but that is life. But on the other hand, if we're holding on to things that are actually harming us, they are holding us back because we don't trust God with them and say, have it, take it back, or give it back to me if you think this is right. Like this idea, like in my case with something horrible is going to happen when you leave people. Or when you get people to kick you out, that's kind of the even the worst part. Getting kicked out is worse than leaving on your own terms. I hope you see that there's a difference, and I hope you see that we get to think about, reflect about our view of God. Is He this cruel, pagan, malevolent God that needs us to sway Him? Or do we believe that He's like the dad, the Abba, that Jesus showed us? The one that says, fear not. No, I got this. I got life for you to the fullest. Don't trust those lies anymore. They're just coming to steal from you. They rob you. They murder you. They destroy you. And it seems like, for me, ever since I went in that direction of pulling more on the thread of a God that actually does not need my good behavior. He doesn't need my sacrifices. He doesn't need my convincing Him of my faithfulness, of my commitment, because it's all been done for me, and I get to rest in that, and I get to lay back and let Him do His magic. Let the Holy Spirit work the magic in me. Kind of get out of the way with all the gunk, the crud from the generations. That's when peace and hope have entered my heart and mind, and I feel God is good and much better than I can imagine. I know that, and He is as good as we need Him to be, and probably better. That if that was my tagline, let it be it. I believe God is as good as we need Him to be, and probably better. Yeah. So it's been a while. I hope what I said was helpful. I'd love to hear feedback. Love that. The interaction with people that are listening to this is just really precious to me. And I bless you all. And thank you for watching.